Welcome to another episode of Conservation Conversations with Adrian. And after our last discussion on sharks, I thought it necessary or critical to talk about our fisheries legislation. And I have to start by saying that Trinidad and Tobago has probably the oldest fisheries legislation in the Caribbean, and I might even go as far to say maybe the oldest in the Western Hemisphere. The Fisheries Act of 1916. Yep, 1916. And to put things into perspective, the Titanic, that sunk in 1912, 4 years prior. The Panama Canal opened in 1914. And in the middle of World War I, Trinidad and Tobago drafted their fisheries legislation, Fisheries Act of 1916. So let us get into the act. The act begins in somewhat what 1916 might have looked like, with three definitions. Just three, that's all. The act defines fish, and fish covers everything. Basically, anything that lives in the sea is considered to be a fish. Crabs, shrimp, oysters, mollusks. They left out a few families. I don't know how that works, but it does say any other marine species, so maybe it's covered there. In addition to that, there's a definition for fisheries officer, who basically just has the powers to enforce the act. And then there's one for prohibited area, which is an area where selective gear or no fishing can take place at all. That's all. That's the three definitions of the 1916 Fisheries Act. So we're off to a great start. The Fisheries Act of 1916 is pretty broad, as you would have expected. It covers both the riverine and territorial waters of Trinidad and Tobago, and then it gives the minister, that's the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries, some broad powers. The minister may make regulations for prescribing the size of mesh, the form and the dimensions of net or other appliances used for fishing. B, the minister may make regulations for restricting the size of fish, crabs, shrimp, turtles that may be taken, and prohibiting the sale or exposing the sale of such. C, for declaring any area to be a prohibited area. D, for prohibiting the killing, harpooning, taking or removing, catching, or any other means of taking possession of fish, or a variety thereof, either absolutely or at such times within such areas as may be prescribed. And E, for prohibiting the sale, offering, or exposing for sale, or the purchase of fish or any other variety thereof, either absolutely or at such times and within such areas as may be prescribed. So the minister has broad powers, and in essence, the minister could implement the measures to select how, what, where, and when fishers can ply their trade. And before we talk about the regulations, the law states that any person that infringes or breaks the regulations is liable for a summary fine of $2,000 and imprisonment for up to 6 months. So basically, everything that we're going to mention going forward, that's the fine and the conviction or the summary conviction that one is likely to face. The regulations begin by specifying the types of nets that can be used within Trinidad and Tobago's waters for fishing. It starts by pointing out the multi-filament and monofilament nets, which fishermen or persons locally usually call the green and the white nets. And then we have the monofilament nets specific for catching mullet. We have monofilament nets for catching flying fish. There are pocket seines for catching mixed whitefish. We have pocket seines for catching prawns, seines for catching bait, cast nets for catching bait, cast seines for catching fish other than cavali or jackfish, seines for catching cavali, seines for catching jackfish, seines known as Italian seines, trawl nets for catching fish, trawl nets for catching shrimp. But we're really going to specify on or focus on a couple of these. We're not going to go through them in depth. And the main ones we want to talk about will be the mono and multi-filament gill nets. We will talk about the monofilament nets for catching mullet. We will also discuss the nets for catching flying fish. So we're talking about the gill nets. The gillnet regulation sets some gear dimensions, but it's hard to say how biologically based these dimensions are. For the monofilament and the multifilament gillnets, or the white and the green nets as we locally call them, there's a maximum dimension of 900 feet in length and 15 feet in depth. And then there's a mesh size of 4.25 inches. Anything below that is illegal. And I don't know if anyone can tell me how the 4.25 inches came up. I would be happy to sit and listen. The other species-specific exemptions are 3.5 inches monofilament gillnet for mullet and 1.75 inches for flying fish. But these mesh sizes really depend on the fish's declared target species and are not really enforceable biologically. Like when you put a 3.5 mesh gillnet in the water, fish aren't going to say, oh no, this is a 3.5 and I'm not a mullet, I can't go into that net. The net is going to catch what it catches. And whether or not the legislation makes the adjustment or provisions so that fishermen don't land anything more than 15% outside of mullet, how does that really help the fishery? Because most things that are caught in a gillnet, by the time a fisherman pulls in his net, they're already dead. So the damage is already done. Really and truly, the point of the gillnet mesh size is to allow fish of a certain size not to get caught. So let's try to understand how a gillnet actually works. The fish don't get caught because they swim into a bag. They get caught because their head fits through the mesh, but their bodies don't go all the way through. And when they try to back out of the net, the mesh just kind of slips behind their gill cover and it becomes wedged or tangled in. And that's why it's called a gillnet. The entire point is that of the mesh size is a biological size selectivity. So basically, if the mesh is too small, you're going to catch a juvenile fish. If the mesh is too big, everything is just going to pass through. And a mesh size that's just right, catches the intended size class. But various species have differing size classes. Various species reach sexual maturity at different sizes. So how does the gillnet really make sense if it's not enforced along with other measures like when, where, timing, length of the net, depth of the net? All of these things also add to how sustainable the gillnet fishery is or could potentially be. And again, it goes back to my question. How did we actually come up with 4.25? And does that measurement really reflect our fishery today? Or is it still stuck in what was back then? So ideally, the mesh size should be tied to the size of the fish population you are trying to protect. Parts 3 to 6 of this regulation get even more funny to me. And not funny in the actual funny sense, just weird. The regulations provide some limitations or minimum sizes of certain fish that can be caught. So we have some at 12 inches and some at 8 inches. And the first thing that you're going to notice is that no scientific names were used. Strictly common names or market names. And that's a red flag. Because as you would all know, different persons in different areas call different species by different names. And in that case, how do you really and truly hold somebody accountable or responsible? So we'll go through the list. We have kingfish. Oh, that's one that we all know and we eat. Check. But then we have Spanish mackerel. How many persons know what Spanish mackerel is? Is it supposed to be carried? Because I know that it's considered carried, but then there's also Serra mackerel that's called carried. Which one is it? And this is where the problem begins. The legislation moves into grouper. And groupers are 12 inches. Which grouper? Because there are many different groupers out there. Are you talking about a Goliath grouper, a Nassau grouper, a Warsaw grouper? Because based on these fish, 12 inches might be plausible based on which one you're talking about. And it goes on to mention codfish. Anyone knows what codfish is? Sorb. I don't know about it. Maybe there's pag. That's probably dog snapper, maybe. Lujantus Joku, I think. Zeblan. Maybe persons know of these, but I certainly don't. And I'm sure that many other persons who eat the fish probably don't know as well. And maybe the fishermen even know these fish by what it looks like, but it's a completely different name. And that's why the legislation needs to be a little more specific and probably utilize scientific names. Anyway, all of those fish I just called can't be caught under 12 inches. Then we have some for the 8-inch bracket, and we go through the same problem again. There's Viva No or Viva Not, and I think that is a red snapper. We have Pomfano. Should that have been Pompano? I don't know. It also lists salmon, and locally we really have no actual true salmon species. All the salmon that we have here miss a key trait or characteristic that true salmon have. It's called an adipose fin. We don't have those down here, but we have a fish that we call salmon. So again, is this something that could be debatable? Because ideally a salmon would fall in the Salmonidae family. But if it's not, then really what is it? And that's pretty much it for most of the species that are mentioned in legislation. Basically, we missed some key ones. There's no mention of mahi-mahi, there's no mention of shark, there's no mention of what some persons would consider crow. There's no mention of ancho. There's so many other fish species that they probably don't need a size limit, or maybe they do, but there's no regulation or no mention of them in the regulation. So is it that we can catch them at any size, we can catch them at any amount, any volume, anywhere? How do we go about managing this? Because a 4.25 mesh size to manage a shark fishery is ridiculous, in my opinion at least. Beyond that, the regulation moves to mention that sardine would only be or should only be sold to a bona fide fisherman for the use as bait. We move through a few points that talk about seines and where certain boats can operate based on the trawling, and we're not going to go too in depth in this video at least. Beyond that, there's the oyster legislation, or the regulation rather, mentioning how seasonal it is and where you can do this oyster harvesting during that season. And then we talk about turtle excluder devices and resuscitation of turtles once they are removed from nets. But here's the real takeaway. Trinidad and Tobago is currently managing a 2026 ocean with a 1916 legislation, before things like sonar, outboard engines, stock assessment, and marine conservation was even a topic. And because of that, our regulations still rely on mesh sizes with little biological basis, a species list that is outdated with common names, and enforcement rules that depend on whatever happens to show up on a fisherman's boat on a given day. None of this really reflects modern science, modern fisheries, or modern ecosystems, and it doesn't take into consideration the impacts of climate change or what fishing has done over the past 110 years. So it's an act that simply wasn't built for any of this, and maybe at the time it was good. There have been some additions along the way, but really and truly we need something new. And that's why so many persons are requesting that the draft Fisheries Management Bill of 2023, I believe, come into play. There's a lot more that went into the development of this bill, and it will support our fishermen a lot more. It will support anyone who consumes fish a lot more, and it supports our economy a lot more. That being said, what this tells us is simple. Our fishers are not the problem. Our legislation is where it begins. If we want sustainable fisheries, safe fishing gear, clearer rules, and real protection for our vulnerable species, we need the legal framework and the systems that to be effective. It needs to match what is happening in our oceans today and not what was happening in the world back in 1916. So it's time for us to modernize, it's time for us to update, and it's time for fisheries legislation to actually fit the fisheries that we have today. Again, this is another episode of Conservation Conversations with Adrian, and we're talking about fisheries. Thank you for joining.